have a super interesting show for you today on what your God says about you based on your personality type. Hi, my name is Brit Hartley. I'm an atheist spiritual director with a master's degree in theology, and my focus is on secular spirituality or spirituality without faith, because as you're going to see with this video, our conceptions of God tell us a lot more about you than they do about the nature of God. So let's start here. If you have a high need for order and structure, you tend towards, in whatever religion you were raised in, fundamentalism, because you have rule-based gods, because that is what your brain needs to feel safe. So these people tend to believe in legalistic kind of gods with very clear punishments and rewards. So these are people who are high in authoritarian personalities, who lean conservative, since authority is a political value of the right. And they're also high in conscientiousness, which just means as a personality type, they feel safest. Their nervous system feels safest when there are clear lines and boundaries, someone in charge who is going to keep it that way. And you stay safe by staying in good graces of the authority in charge. Now, to many people, this feels like hell. This feels very controlling. But if you have this personality type, it actually feels like safety. It helps you to function. So you can see how religion got sucked into this. If you're a person who feels safe with authority, then Trump is your politician and the God of the Bible is your God, especially the God that has like clear lines in the Bible, like this is the line, this is the way, everybody else goes to hell. All of that can join together quite easily if you're that kind of personality type. So the next one, if you take like the big 5 personality test, if you are high in openness and low in your need for structure or authority, then you're going to tend towards a more mystical kind of God. So these are people who enjoy ambiguity and complexity. They may reject religious systems in favor of mysticism, pantheism, or spiritual but not religious. So this is going to be common in the political, like if you're politically liberal, and artists, philosophers. Some examples of how this might show up with you is like Jungian spirituality, Buddhism, Taoism, cosmic consciousness, spiritual but not religious. It's just not really well defined, which gives you just a lot of space for exploration if you're this type of personality. Now, if you're on the autistic spectrum, this data looks like a U. So you're either like fundamentalist in whatever your religion is, or you're atheist, but not really in between. So religious beliefs are accepted if it's highly systematized and consistent within itself, or the whole thing will be rejected and seen as illogical, and you'll swing over to atheism. So people on the spectrum are more likely to take the religion seriously if they are in it, or they become atheist. And this would include personality types, even if you're not on the spectrum, that tend towards like science and engineering. And so I just posted this on my TikTok, and I had a guy who said, I'm an engineer. I was fundamentalist when I was in religion, had a faith crisis, and now I'm atheist. That would be like the most common story for this personality type. The next one is people who have high sensitivity to pattern and agency detection. The people who see where their brain is really, really good at creating patterns. In fact, they're too good, and they're now seeing patterns that aren't really there. So if you have that personality type or brain function, then you're going to create gods that actively intervene in this world. This would not just include God who in theism, this would look like God is reaching out to you all the time. God is always trying to talk to you. If you're in New Age spirituality, this would look like seeing patterns in time, like, oh, it's 11:11, or spirit guides, angel numbers, astrology. Whatever your system of belief is, you're going to feel like astrology is constantly interacting with your real life. Angel numbers, spirit guides, God, scripture, signs from the universe, whatever it is, you're going to feel like it's interacting with you all the time, because you're very sensitive to this brain capacity to overdevelop pattern creation. So evolutionary psychology suggests that this is why human beings believe in spirits or gods in the first place, is because we developed this overactive imagination in order to help us survive. But the fascinating thing is that we also find that this is going to be highest in people who have childhood trauma, because children can overdevelop pattern recognition behaviors as a way to stay safe in an unsafe environment. So this personality type has more religious experience. In general, their brain can go from zero to magic like really quickly on its own, very good, too good even at seeing patterns, and more likely to come from childhood trauma, which is going to make deconstruction from religion a lot more painful, because it's going to be a lot more to unpack, because you develop skills for overcoming trauma that are now affecting how religious you are. So that's going to be very messy in a deconstruction. The next one is anxiety. If you are high in anxiety, and uncertainty avoidance, you're going to create protective parental gods. So these are people who are high in trait anxiety, but have an external locus of control. And so they're going to seek gods that provide comfort, security, and divine protection. So this is going to be, again, higher in individuals who have faced trauma, also neurotic personalities, and those from very unstable societies. So the gods we create when we are in that kind of society, or you just have that kind of brain, where you are high in anxiety but have an external locus of control, you're going to want to create gods that are nurturing and benevolent and intervening and are some place of kind of ultimate safety, because you're going to need that in order to function. Basically, if you need a parent figure that's going to tell you that everything's going to be okay, if your brain craves that because of anxiety and uncertainty, and you're not getting that from your system or your life or your actual parents, you're going to create that parent god. The next one's super interesting to me, which is disgust sensitivity. And again, I'm not making these emotions up, like anxiety, disgust. These are core emotions in our brain makeup, which is why we see these characters in Inside Out, which is, I think, a brilliant movie that therapists are using to show kids how their brain works, how there's different emotions and triggers going on in their brain. So if you have high disgust sensitivity, your God is going to emphasize cleanliness. So high disgust sensitivity is associated with moral purity concerns and leads to gods that emphasize cleanliness and ritual and moral law. This is going to be more common in strict religious groups and conservative cultures. But if you have someone who takes seriously religions that have strong food laws, sexual purity rules, sin-based morality like fundamentalist Islam or Christianity, chances are they're going to be high in disgust if that religion is working for them, because their religion helps to make sense of their disgust. If you find two gay men kissing disgusting because you have a high disgust sensitivity and you are straight, so that's not your thing, it's going to actually make logical sense to your brain that your God hates homosexuality. That's actually going to make perfect sense to that brain system. If you are high in empathy, however, you're going to have personal, relational, and forgiving gods. So highly empathetic individuals prefer gods that are compassionate, forgiving, and relational rather than punitive and distant. This is going to be more common in women. God is always nicer in the construct of female brains. This is also higher in caregivers and anyone who has high oxytocin levels. So if you are a woman and you have high oxytocin levels, and let's say you're a nurse or some kind of caregiver, I already know without meeting you that your Jesus is not the Jesus that comes and sends unbelievers to hell or has strict moral codes. Your Jesus is the peak of compassion and love. And that's what you're going to read if you read scripture. That's what you're going to see in Jesus. And you're going to want to believe that people in the next life will get to say sorry to each other and will live in love with each other and forgiveness. And so your God and your heaven is going to reflect that because you are high in empathy just as a person. If you are low in empathy and emotionality and high in rationality, you're not going to get that Jesus is my best friend kind of God. You're going to get a deistic abstract God, or atheism. So this would include the founding fathers, who were far more rational than they were emotional as personality types. And they were largely deists, and deists believe that, maybe there's a creator God that helps to make sense of why there's something rather than nothing. But this is not a God that's going to help you to find your keys, or a God that's going to make you look up in order to, see 1111 on a microwave or whatever it is. and if you're high in logical reasoning, you're going to tend to believe in a non-intervening God or just outright atheism. So this is most common in philosophers, scientists, and those who have just like a high need for cognition. They're rational. This would be the God of like an Enneagram 5 if you're into Enneagram. And it's funny that the female who is high in emotion and the male who is high in rationality will sometimes marry each other because they need the other to balance themselves out. But they're going to come to that relationship with different kinds of gods. So the male high in rationality is either going to be more atheist or more deistic, and the woman is going to feel like Jesus is my best friend. And so they're going to come to that relationship with different gods. So if you're high in individualism, you're going to have more of a personal DIY spirituality. And this is more common in highly individualistic cultures, or if you just as a personality have high self-reliance and high individualism. And so these people tend to create customized mix and match kind of spiritual beliefs. And it's more likely to happen in Western societies because, of course, individualism is a collective core value. And you're also going to see this in the spiritual, not religious group and also New Age followers. So what this looks like is if I look at your spirituality and you have a mix of like Christmas, a little astrology, a few tarot cards, you do mushrooms from time to time, you go to concerts, you use the waking app, the waking up meditation app on Sundays, and then you listen to Jungian podcasts on your drive. That's like 7, 8 different spiritual paths. And so you're doing this a buffet style to do your own spiritual path that is unique to you because you value individuality. And the opposite is going to be true if you're high in collectivism. So if you're high in collectivism, you're going to create tribal, ancestral, community-based kinds of gods. So collectivist cultures tend to focus on either ancestral worship or communal deities like a pantheon of deities, and gods that just emphasize duty and harmony that keep the cosmic order going. So this is higher, obviously, in Eastern religions, higher in indigenous traditions, because those societies have more likelihood to collectively value community. So in these indigenous societies or collectivist societies, places like Japan, where individualism is less praised because you have to think about your connection to the whole, you're more likely to get ancestor worship or pantheism, where there's like a community of gods that keeps these things going. Just like in the community, everybody needs to do their part to keep things going. And so that'll be kind of reflected in the pantheon of gods or in the ancestor worship. And then this is an interesting one. I want to talk also about what can happen to your brain as far as like brain injuries or brain diseases, and how that's also going to change how you think about God. So an interesting one is if you have cognitive decline, you're going to create passive or absent gods. So studies show that Alzheimer patients and those with damaged theory of mind regions of their brain will shift towards deistic or absent gods because they lose the cognitive ability to attribute intent. So your brain literally loses the ability to ascribe intent to what's going on around you. And so naturally your God is going to become more distant, even if you were super fundamentalist before your cognitive decline. Now, dementia is a little different. I think Alzheimer's is under the umbrella of dementia, but dementia, we're seeing something a little bit different. So in dementia, early stages of dementia, people become hyper-religious due to damage in the frontal lobe. And that's going to control your critical thinking and your skepticism. But in later stages of dementia, they return to like a simplistic childhood faith, not doctrinal theology, but like an emotional comfort-based belief, like I talk to God, like I talk to my friend. And then some patients will lose religious belief entirely if their temporal lobes are affected by their dementia. And so you'll see someone who was like a Christian apologist become, in their early stages, more hyper-religious when they get dementia. And then in later stages, they'll just like feel maybe the presence of God, but not be able to explain it. And then in later stages would lose their belief in God altogether. Another interesting one is temporal lobe epilepsy, TLE, where you will get a hyper-religious brain. So what happens? The temporal lobes, especially the right side, is involved with mystical experiences and religious feelings. So in people with TLE, electrical disturbances can cause intense religious visions, auditory hallucinations, and deep feelings of a divine presence. So how this affects your belief on God, people with TLE will become intensely religious and experience God as like this overwhelming force. So some report direct conversations with God or cosmic unity. And we even look back and see some religious figures in history, like Joan of Arc, may have had TLE because they just have such vivid religious kind of hallucinations. So a person with TLE might go from not being religious at all to claiming that they personally talk to God daily and believe that they have a divine mission. That's not actually unusual, which is really interesting. And then in severe epilepsy, where they have to cut the corpus callosum because you're having such epilepsy with your brain, and you have to disconnect the two brain hemispheres, you're going to create essentially two separate minds in one person, and each hemisphere is going to process the world differently. So how does this affect your belief on God? This is fascinating. Very early science. I'm not married to anything on this list. This is just the data as I'm seeing it in these studies. The left hemisphere tends to, this language is really tricky, but it tends towards language. And so usually it maintains the person's original beliefs, original religious beliefs when you sever the brain from the other side. The right hemisphere tends towards experience and is a little bit more emotional. And so it often lacks a structured belief in God, but it may feel still like a spiritual presence or a unity or awe. It will still feel those things. So in experiments, one side of the brain can believe in God while the other side doesn't. So we do have split brain studies where a patient was shown the question, do you believe in God? And the left hemisphere, the speaking side, answered yes, but the right hemisphere, responding by your left hand writing, will write no. So you'll actually have two different beliefs within your own brain, which I find fascinating. Like split brain studies, I could listen to those like all goddamn day. Like those are so interesting. But of course, like it doesn't happen all the time, so our data is limited. But that's what we're seeing so far. Psychedelics, this is a little different because this isn't a brain injury, but it certainly affects your brain. You're going to experience God as more of an experience rather than a person. So what happens is psychedelics will shut down the default mode network of your brain. This is the part of the brain that like feels like a you, like I'm a Brittany and I have an ego and this is what I do and this is what I like. It shuts that down, and that allows for this kind of dissolution of self boundaries and these deep states of consciousness that are more mystical. And so many users report becoming one with God or experiencing God as some kind of infinite consciousness rather than a personal being. And people will lose traditional religious beliefs and embrace something like panentheism, where God is where God is a part of everything, or atheistic spirituality. So religious experiences become less about doctrine and more about unity and love. So what's common is like a fundamentalist Christian might take psilocybin, have a mystical experience, and shift from like a judgmental God to kind of like an all-encompassing energy of love kind of God. And at the same time, if you're an atheist and you do psychedelics, especially psilocybin, you're two-thirds of the atheists who do mushrooms do not self-report as atheists. They'll self-report as something else, like spiritual but not religious or something else, because they're more open to this mystical experience of what we have called God. So atheists are less likely to call themselves atheist, and fundamentalists are less likely to hold on to a judgmental God just because of that experience in your brain. Near-death experiences, a little bit similar but different. You're more likely to see God as light and love. So what happens is during near-death states, you get oxygen deprivation and surges in neurotransmitters like DMT and serotonin, and this creates visions of tunnels, lights, and sometimes divine beings. And so the effect on God will be that people will shift from a strict religious framework to a universalist or a mystical type framework where they kind of expand their definition of God, that God is this warm and loving light rather than like a doctrinal judge. Fear of death often also disappears and it's replaced by a sense of cosmic connection. So a common example would be like a conservative Christian dies for 2 minutes, sees a being of light that just kind of radiates pure love, but never mentions Jesus. And so they return to this belief that maybe all religions are paths to the same divine source rather than belief in just their religion alone. That would be common for near-death experiences. With depression, you get one of two things that happen. So in major depressive disorder, MDD, dopamine and serotonin levels drop, causing anhedonia, which is an inability to feel pleasure. And it also increases your cognitive rigidity or your black and white thinking, just as an effect of your depression. So how this plays out with God, some become even more deeply religious and they seek God as their last source of hope and meaning when they're in their depression, whereas others will become more atheist and will lose their ability to feel divine connection at all and feel like they don't see any meaning to life. And so the God image shifts from loving to distant or absent. So you either become more religious and black and white because you need something to hold on to when you're depressed, or you just kind of lose God altogether because you just don't feel God anymore. So there's kind of like a divergence in that road. So strokes are super interesting because you can get a spiritual awakening. So what happens with strokes, particularly in the right parietal lobe, will reduce ego-centered thinking and increase your feelings of unity with the universe, just like you would on a psychedelic trip. So some people may become deeply spiritual even though they weren't before their stroke. And so their God shifts from a personal deity to a universal force, or from no deity at all to some kind of universal force. So like a previously non-religious scientist can have a stroke and afterward believe that not really in a personal God, but some kind of loving cosmic oneness kind of God, because what's happening in the brain is similar to what happens on psychedelics, where you lose that ego-centered thinking part of the brain. So the reason I tend towards atheism is not because I know what consciousness is, or I've looked out into the universe and I've searched every nook and cranny, and I know I've concluded that there could be no God. I also don't know how life began. It's just that for 20 years straight, I've been studying what kinds of gods different societies create and how that changes over time based on what the society needs. And I've been talking to people about their beliefs for decades. And now in coaching, it's what I do all day, every day. I can see how the person is changing, and then I can see how then their God is changing. Now in coaching, I don't ever I don't ever challenge anyone's beliefs directly. I'm just looking for how to make their beliefs healthier, or what their beliefs say about what they need, to give them more resources and tools for that space. So in coaching, I would never say like, you need to become an atheist. I'm just, as an atheist spiritual director, saying this is what your God is telling me about you. And this is then the tools and resources that you need for your personality type. And so while it is possible that God is always meeting us where we are, meaning like if we want strict rules as a parent God, then we get a strict rules kind of God. If we want a loving parent God, then we get a loving parent God. It is possible that God is just like the ultimate shapeshifter and is meeting each individual person and each society based on their needs. But then that would have to mean that God is contrary, meaning God is inconsistent. So to some people, he's answering prayers that, X is true, X is the true religion. And for some people, he's saying that the answer is Y. And by the way, 60% of all people who pray if their religion is true get the answer that it is, no matter what religion you're talking about. So it's possible that God is just like this inconsistent shapeshifter, and there is actually a real God behind Zeus and Thor and every near-death experience and every religion and every spiritual experience. But considering how bad we are at playing the game of gods, it is just far more likely that we are the ones creating gods. We create the gods that we individually and collectively need. And as our needs change, our gods change. So here's the path that I see most often in my work as a spiritual director, because I have a master's degree in Christian theology and I was raised Mormon. So the majority of the people who I see who resonate with me are Mormon and Christian clients. So usually this person starts out with God as some kind of rule giver, or like universal Santa genie is kind of like how it starts. So this is, in a stages of faith faith, this would be early fundamentalist belief. We have a high need of certainty, of structure, and external validation. And God is like this authoritarian father figure who enforces strict rules. There's rewards for obedience and punishments for sin. And a common crisis that happens is that you encounter contradictions in scripture or religious trauma, or just realizing that this is more, morally complex than they thought. And so the person will start questioning the authority and the rigid rules. So then usually God becomes a more loving parent. This is a softening of their fundamentalism. And the stage of faith for this is like progressive Christianity. So you grow in cognitive flexibility and increased empathy. And now you're a little bit more flexible. It's less about punishment. It's more about love and grace. Jesus is emphasized as a compassionate figure rather than an enforcer. Hell becomes metaphorical, or it's rejected altogether. And then you're still struggling, though, with theological inconsistencies, the harm done by religion, or the need for deeper authenticity. This is when we shift then for God becoming a more personal, mystical presence than the gods previously. So this would be, for a stage of faith, this would be like universalism or a deistic belief or a mystic belief. So you're just open to ambiguity and complexity and paradox. You value personal experience over doctrine. God's role is no longer, an external figure judging actions. It becomes more abstract, like the ground of being or the force of love or energy in the universe. It's more non-dogmatic. It's more flexible. It's more non-intervening, and it fits more with science. So then it's common to have a crisis where you start questioning whether belief itself is necessary or whether God is still meaningful for you, whether you need God at all. And then you start to wonder if belief in God is good for you and good for society in general, since it often causes so much harm. That's when God turns into like a symbol or a psychological projection. This would be like agnostics or people who get into Jungian psychology, where we realize that God's role is no longer a literal being, but maybe a symbol. Like we use the word God as a symbol for goodness or a symbol for experiences that we have. It's a metaphor for meaning. It's, God is the blanket that we put over the mystery to give it shape, things like that. And religion becomes more about personal interpretation rather than objective truth. It becomes more individual and experiential. Then the common crisis is wrestling with meaning and purpose without any divine guidance. And then the person starts to wonder whether they need to hold on to their belief at all. And this is where you enter post-theism, atheism, or secular humanism, or sometimes all three. So this would be when you finally have internalized morality, you're self-sufficient, you're comfortable with the idea of death, you're comfortable with ambiguity, and now you really have no psychological need for God at all. And so you start rejecting God because now you see that you don't need belief in order to live a meaningful life. You have meaningful work, you have meaningful relationships, you have some meaning and purpose, you have a sense of internal morality, so you don't need God telling you what to do anymore, and you kind of just outgrow God altogether. So that would be like the most common path that I see with a Christian deconstruction. So there's like four main things that happen. First, you have a decrease in external authority. So you increase your internal kind of moral autonomy. You have a decrease for certainty. So you have an increased tolerance and ambiguity. You have a decreased need of divine intervention. So you have an increased sense of personal agency. And then you have a decreased fear of punishment and an increase in intrinsic motivation for ethical behavior. So things that you used to need, those four things that you used to need externally, you're now doing internally. And then your beliefs in God entirely go away because psychologically you have no need for God. So as people get better at gathering tools for their anxiety, their existential fears, their needs, their core values, their needs for validation, as more and more of that becomes internal, you need God less and less until you graduate from God altogether. And it is not not like I'm floating above this where everybody else is like biased in their opinion of God except for me. I am very much in this. I wanted God to exist because I wanted to believe in ultimate truth and ultimate justice for those wronged in this life, because those are my core values. And I made Mormon apologetics work when I needed it to, in order to stay in that community that I was benefiting from. When I was no longer benefiting from that community, I made Christian apologetics work when I needed it to, because I really didn't want to lose my faith in God. And then I was doing open and relational theology because it was the only way that I could make sense of God and the problem of evil. And then I lost faith in God altogether as I was continuing to study these things, which is common for those who are higher in logic than emotion. And I had to face all that the God concept was holding for me. And it was hard at first to replace some of those things that God was doing for me psychologically. But I got to the point where now I am thriving post-God, and I no longer need God for anything at all. So my brain doesn't do any work trying to create a God it needs, because I'm just over here living my one life. I have a sense of internal morality. I have a sense of meaning. I have a sense of purpose. I have good relationships. And so I'm just over here living my life, and my brain doesn't spend time creating gods. So to me, what God you believe in tells me more about you than it ever will tell me about the nature of God. And if I could give you better resources for what you're psychologically needing, then you don't need to play games with gods at all in order to function or thrive. And so my purpose in coaching is not to try, like, I don't have an atheist agenda where some people really don't do well in atheism just as a personality type. And I'm not sure that there is no God. All I'm saying is I can use what you say about your God to give me a sense for what you psychologically need. And if I can give you better tools and resources for that, then you can explore God and theology and philosophy and astrology without forcing things to be true because you psychologically need it to be true. That's where we get stuck. That's where we get pigeonholed as humans, when we have to put on blinders or ignore science or whatever in order to make things true that we need to be true. It's much more healthy. Let's explore these things without having to make things true because you need it to be true, because you have the resources that you need for that thing that you psychologically need. So for more on thriving post-religion and what spirituality looks like post-religion, follow me here for more no-nonsense spirituality. And next week, I'm going to do absurdism and how I think absurdism is sometimes a lacking philosophy as far as like a complete philosophical framework. And then I think the week after, I'm going to do one on the Enneagram, which is just a tool that I've used for self-exploration, and also what would be the God of each Enneagram number, which I've never thought about before, but it's a thought experiment that I'm going to think about, and I'll do a YouTube video on that. So let me know if I got your personality type wrong, where it was just a total miss. Some of this is, especially when we're talking about brain studies and split brain stuff, we're very early in our science. And so I'm just looking at tendencies and patterns. I could be wrong about any one of these things. I'm not married to any of this, but let me know if I kind of nailed your personality type and the God that you either used to believe in or believe in now. I'm very curious. So let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next week.